The doctor made the first cut in April 1920. What he found under the simple clothing of the dead woman went against 18 years of what the community knew. His hand shook as he reached for his private journal, unsure if what was in front of him was a crime, a tragedy, or something the law had no words for. Before we get into the story, what's the darkest case you've ever heard or experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. Also, tell us where you're watching from today and what time is it right now. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid of the dark. Now, let's continue with the story. Dr. Samuel Brennan had worked as a doctor in Harlan County, Kentucky for 23 years. He delivered babies in cabins without electricity, fixed bones broken in mining accidents, and signed death certificates for victims of everything from typhoid to violence. Nothing in his medical training or small-town experience prepared him for what he discovered on the morning of April 14, 1920. The call had come just after sunrise. Warren Fletcher's wife, Helen, had been found dead in their farmhouse 3 miles outside the small community of Evarts. The situation seemed tragic but straightforward. A fall perhaps, maybe a stroke. Fletcher himself had ridden into town on horseback, his face pale, his words barely understandable. The sheriff went with Brennan to the property, expecting to fill out routine paperwork. The Fletcher farmhouse sat alone among rolling hills, reachable only by a rough dirt road that became impossible to pass during heavy rains. The building itself was simple, but well kept, with curtains pulled across every window. Warren Fletcher waited outside, unable or unwilling to enter the house where his wife's body lay. Inside, Helen Fletcher rested on the kitchen floor, positioned with unnatural care. Someone had arranged her body with obvious respect, hands folded across her chest, hair smoothed back from her face. She wore a heavy wool dress despite the spring warmth, buttoned to the collar and going down to her ankles. Brennan noticed the clothing's unusual thickness, designed to hide rather than show the figure beneath. The sheriff stepped outside to question Fletcher further, leaving Brennan alone with the deceased. Standard procedure required a basic examination to determine cause of death. Brennan began his check methodically, looking for obvious injuries, noting the fixed pupils and cooling skin. Then he began the physical examination that would make him question everything he thought he knew about the Fletcher household. The physical reality went completely against the outward appearance. Helen Fletcher, the quiet woman who'd lived in this community for 18 years, who neighbors knew as Warren's devoted wife, had the physical characteristics of a biological male. Brennan sat back on his heels, his medical certainty crashing into social impossibility. He completed his examination in silence, his mind racing through consequences he couldn't begin to process. The cause of death was clear enough. Blunt force trauma to the skull, the injury hidden beneath that carefully arranged hair. But how to document the rest? How to explain what he'd discovered to the sheriff, to the county officials, to a community that would demand answers he didn't know how to give? Brennan closed his medical bag and walked outside into the cool April morning, carrying knowledge that would turn a simple death investigation into something far more complex and disturbing. The marriage license sat in the county clerk's office, yellowed but readable. Dated September 7, 1902. Warren Fletcher, age 26, farmer. Helen Marsh, age 23. No job listed. The document showed nothing unusual on its surface, just another union recorded in the leather-bound book that documented hundreds of similar arrangements across Harlan County. But the story behind that certificate proved far more complex than the simple facts it contained. Helen Marsh had arrived in Evarts on a late summer afternoon in 1902, carrying a single carpet bag and wearing clothing too nice for the rural Kentucky town. She'd stepped off the train alone with no family to meet her and no clear explanation for her presence. The station master later remembered that she'd handed him a written note asking directions to the boarding house, pointing to her throat and shaking her head when he tried to talk. Within a week, she'd met Warren Fletcher. Within a month, they were married. The speed of the relationship raised eyebrows, but in a time when practical reasons often mattered more than romantic ones, a quiet bachelor farmer taking a wife wasn't particularly shocking. People assumed Helen brought money or that Warren simply needed help managing his property. The throat problem became Helen's defining feature. She communicated through written notes, brief and to the point, her handwriting surprisingly bold and angular. Dr. Brennan's predecessor, Old Doc Holloway, claimed to have examined her once in those early years. His notes, stored in the Medical Society archives, mentioned chronic inflammation, but offered no specific diagnosis. He'd recommended rest and avoidance of strain to the vocal cords. Helen had apparently followed this advice strictly for 18 years. The newlyweds settled into the isolated farmhouse that would become their permanent home. Warren handled all interactions with town merchants, neighbors, and officials. He bought supplies, sold crops, attended church services alone. When asked about his wife's absence from community gatherings, he explained matter of factly that she tired easily and preferred the quiet of home. In a region where many women lived hard, exhausting lives, this explanation satisfied most curiosity. Property records showed the farm had belonged to Warren's family. His parents died in a typhoid outbreak in 1898, leaving him the sole heir at age 22. For 4 years he lived alone, developing a reputation as a capable, if unremarkable, farmer. Neighbors described him as polite but distant, someone who fulfilled his obligations without seeking friendship. The marriage certificate listed Helen's previous residence as Lexington, Kentucky, nearly 200 miles north. No family members attended the wedding. No letters ever arrived addressed to Helen from any relatives. When the minister who performed the ceremony later tried to recall details, he remembered only that the bride had seemed nervous and that the groom spoke both sets of vows with Helen nodding her agreement. Bank records from the Everett Savings and Trust revealed something strange about the Fletcher household finances. Deposits and withdrawals had Warren's signature only until 1906, when documents began appearing with Helen's name. The signatures looked remarkably similar to Warren's own handwriting, though the bank clerk who processed these transactions never questioned the arrangement. Many husbands managed their wives' affairs after all. One transaction stood out in the saved records. In 1907, Helen Fletcher sold a piece of land she'd apparently inherited, though no deed transfer or inheritance documentation existed in county records. The sale brought $200, a large sum. The buyer's receipt had Helen's signature, that same angular handwriting, but also included a thumbprint, as if someone had insisted on additional proof of identity. The Fletcher marriage existed in public records as a series of ordinary documents. A wedding certificate, property transfers, tax payments. Each piece of paper told a story of conventional rural life. None of them hinted at the deception that would be maintained without apparent incident for nearly 2 decades. None suggested the violence that would eventually shatter the careful construction Warren and Helen had built together. Ruth Dalton lived on the neighboring property, separated from the Fletcher farm by a quarter-mile of wooded hillside. In 1934, 14 years after Helen's death, a journalist from Louisville tracked her down to ask about the Fletchers. By then, Ruth was 62, widowed, and willing to discuss memories she'd kept private for decades. She remembered the autumn of 1903, her first attempt at neighborly connection. Ruth had baked an apple pie, still warm, and walked the distance to welcome the new Mrs. Fletcher properly. Warren answered the door, thanked her kindly, but explained his wife was resting and couldn't receive visitors. Ruth glimpsed a figure in the dim interior, someone tall and angular moving quickly away from the doorway. Helen never came to the church socials, Ruth told the journalist. Never attended the quilting circles or the harvest gatherings. For years, I thought maybe she was shy, or perhaps she'd come from a wealthy family and found our rural ways beneath her. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite identify. The few times Ruth encountered Helen outdoors, the observation stayed with her. Helen wore men's work boots visible beneath her long skirts, the leather scuffed and practical. Her hands, when Ruth glimpsed them, showed carluses in unusual places. Not the wear patterns of typical housework, but something different. Helen moved with long strides, catching herself and shortening her steps when she noticed Ruth watching. In 1908, Ruth's youngest child fell ill with scarlet fever. Desperate and frightened, she'd knocked on the Fletcher door near midnight, hoping Warren might ride for the doctor. Helen had appeared instead, wrapped in a heavy robe despite the summer heat. She'd written quickly on a slate board kept near the entrance, "Warren in town, back tomorrow. So sorry." But what Ruth remembered most clearly was Helen's eyes in the lamplight. Not their color or shape, but the expression within them. Recognition of Ruth's maternal terror, a depth of understanding that suggested personal familiarity with fear and desperate hiding. Helen had reached out briefly, squeezed Ruth's shoulder in comfort, then withdrawn back into the house. The gesture felt masculine in its shortness and strength, yet carried genuine compassion. Her voice, Ruth said to the journalist, pausing over the memory. I heard it once, just once. This was maybe 1915 or 16. I'd walked over unannounced, which I'd learned not to do, but I'd found a letter blown into my yard addressed to Warren. I heard voices from the barn, an argument. One voice was definitely Warren's. The other was lower than I expected, rougher. When they noticed me, the talking stopped immediately. Warren came out alone, took the letter, thanked me curtly, and waited until I left before returning to the barn. Ruth described other strange things that built up over the years. The Fletchers never hired seasonal help, unusual for a working farm. They attended no funerals, even for families Warren had known since childhood. When the traveling photographer came through in 1912, offering family portraits, Warren declined without explanation, though many farming families scraped together money for such rare documentation. The most unsettling incident occurred in winter 1919. Ruth's husband had been hunting and took shelter in the Fletcher barn during an unexpected snowstorm. Through gaps in the wood slats, he'd seen Helen working, stacking hay bales with efficient strength. She'd removed her heavy outer coat in the barn's relative warmth. Even beneath the remaining layers of clothing, her silhouette struck Ruth's husband as wrong somehow, though he couldn't say exactly what troubled him. My husband came home disturbed, she recalled. He said there was something unnatural about that household, but when I pressed him to explain, he couldn't find words for it. He just said Warren Fletcher's wife wasn't what she appeared to be, and we should keep our distance. Ruth had followed that advice. In the months before Helen's death, she'd seen the couple only twice, always from a distance. Both times their body language suggested tension. Warren gestured forcefully while Helen stood rigid and unresponsive. Ruth had wondered if their long, strange marriage was finally breaking apart, but she'd never imagined it would end in violence or that the truth about Helen would prove far stranger than any guessing. The Everett Savings and Trust kept careful records, and those ledgers told a story of slow financial collapse. In 1914, Warren Fletcher's account showed healthy balances, the result of good harvests and careful management. By 1919, the numbers painted a dramatically different picture. The first major withdrawal came in October 1917. 500, nearly half the account balance removed in a single transaction. The bank manager's note indicated the money went towards settling a debt with a Louisville creditor, though no details specified the debt's nature. 3 months later, another $200 disappeared, this time documented as payment for livestock that never appeared on the Fletcher property. Thomas Garrett, the bank's assistant manager, later provided testimony that revealed the human side behind those cold numbers. He'd known Warren Fletcher casually for years, processing his deposits and withdrawals without incident. But starting in 1918, Warren's behavior during bank visits changed noticeably. He seemed distracted, Garrett recalled in a sworn statement, always looking over his shoulder, rushing through transactions. Once I asked if everything was well at the farm. He snapped at me, said his affairs were his own business, then apologized immediately. That wasn't like Warren. He'd always been steady, if quiet. Property records revealed the most dramatic evidence of desperation. In March 1919, Warren sold 40 acres of timberland, roughly a quarter of his total holdings. The buyer, a lumber company from Lexington, paid market value, but the sale itself signaled crisis. That land had been in the Fletcher family for 2 generations. Selling it meant either immediate need or abandonment of long-term planning. The truly strange aspect emerged in the deed transfer documents. Helen's signature appeared alongside Warren's as required for married couples selling joint property. But the notary public, a man named Edwin Stokes, added an unusual note to his certification. He'd written in cramped script along the margin, wife unable to speak, verification allowed, nodded consent after reading document thoroughly. Standard procedure required verbal confirmation from both parties. The fact that Stokes documented the exception suggested he'd found the situation unusual enough to need explanation. Yet he'd accepted the nodded consent and completed the transaction, either trusting Warren's established reputation or unwilling to investigate further. More troubling patterns emerged in the mortgage records. In June 1919, Warren borrowed $300 against the remaining property, using the farmhouse and land as collateral. The interest rate was punishing 18%, the kind of terms typically reserved for desperate borrowers with poor prospects. The loan came due in 6 months with full repayment required or foreclosure proceedings would begin. Bank letters preserved in the archives showed increasingly urgent notices sent to the Fletcher farm. First polite reminders, then stronger warnings. Finally, a notification that foreclosure procedures would begin in January 1920 unless payment arrived immediately. The final letter, dated March 5, 1920, informed Warren that a county representative would visit the property on April 20th to assess the land's value for auction. Helen's death occurred April 14th, 6 days before that scheduled visit. The financial documents revealed another curious detail. Several transactions from 1918 and 1919 showed attempts to access Helen's personal funds, the money from that mysterious land sale back in 1907. But those accounts had been emptied months earlier, the withdrawals bearing Helen's signature in that familiar angular handwriting. Thomas Garrett remembered Warren's reaction when informed the accounts were empty. He seemed genuinely surprised, Garrett said. He asked when the withdrawals had occurred, and I showed him the dates. He went pale, actually gripped the counter for support. Then he left without another word. The money's destination remained unknown. No corresponding deposits appeared in Warren's accounts. No major purchases were documented. Several $100s had simply vanished, leaving the Fletchers facing financial ruin with no apparent reserves. Whatever crisis had consumed their savings, it had done so quietly and completely, draining away their security just as external pressures mounted to unbearable levels. Sheriff James Holloway stood in his office 3 days after the discovery, staring at Dr. Brennan's confidential report. The document sat on his desk like something toxic, words that couldn't be unwritten, facts that couldn't be ignored. He'd been sheriff of Harlan County for 11 years, handling everything from bootlegging to land disputes. Nothing had prepared him for this. The immediate problem was procedural. Kentucky law in 1920 provided no framework for documenting what Brennan had discovered. The death certificate required identifying the deceased, but which identity should be recorded, the legal identity everyone knew or the biological reality no one had suspected? Holloway drafted 3 different versions, crossing out each in frustration. His incident report proved equally difficult. The physical evidence clearly indicated violence, blunt force trauma, defensive wounds on the forearms, signs of struggle in the disarranged kitchen. This was homicide, not accident or natural death. But how to describe the victim without revealing information that would destroy whatever remained of the deceased's dignity? Holloway sent a telegraph to the state attorney general's office in Frankfort. His carefully worded message requested guidance on unusual circumstances requiring legal clarification in a death investigation. The response arrived 48 hours later, short and unhelpful. Sheriff Holloway, document facts as discovered. Proceed with investigation per standard protocols. Refer complex legal questions to county prosecutor. The county prosecutor was a 28-year-old attorney named Martin Jessup, newly appointed and eager to establish his reputation. Holloway had worked with him on 2 previous cases, finding him capable but overly concerned with public perception. This case would test Jessup in ways the young lawyer couldn't possibly anticipate. Meanwhile, Warren Fletcher remained at his farm, not yet arrested, but under obvious suspicion. Holloway had questioned him twice, finding his answers consistent, but evasive. Warren admitted to discovering his wife's body, claimed he'd been in the barn doing morning chores when he heard a crash from the house. He'd found Helen on the kitchen floor, already dead, and rode immediately for help. The timeline didn't work. Brennan estimated death had occurred at least 6 hours before Warren reported it based on body temperature and rigor mortis. Warren had been alone with the body for hours, doing something that left the kitchen oddly clean despite signs of earlier violence. He'd changed Helen's clothing. Brennan noted the original garments found wadded in a bedroom corner, blood-stained and torn. Holloway's private notes, discovered decades later in his grandson's attic, revealed his internal struggle. He'd written, "If I reveal the truth about Helen Fletcher, I destroy her memory and create scandal that serves no purpose. If I conceal it, I compromise the investigation and potentially let a killer manipulate the proceedings. The law gives me no guidance. My conscience provides no clear answer." The social consequences troubled him equally. Rural Kentucky communities were tightly bound by reputation and respectability. The Fletcher family, though Warren was the last of his line, had lived in Harlan County for 3 generations. Revealing Helen's secret would taint that legacy permanently. It would also raise uncomfortable questions about how such a deception persisted for 18 years without anyone in authority noticing or stepping in. Holloway consulted with the county coroner, Judge Harold Kincaid, who'd held his position for 23 years. Kincaid listened to the situation, his expression growing increasingly serious. Finally, he offered his opinion. "James, this is beyond a small-town understanding. Document what you must, but consider carefully what serves justice versus what serves gossip. The deceased can't defend their choices. We shouldn't condemn them in death for whatever private arrangements they made in life. But there was still the matter of violence. Someone had killed Helen Fletcher, regardless of what secret she carried. Holloway couldn't ignore that basic fact. He drafted an arrest warrant for Warren Fletcher, charging him with murder. The warrant described the victim simply as Helen Fletcher, wife of the accused, avoiding any mention of the complications that would emerge at trial. On April 18, 1920, Holloway rode out to the Fletcher farm with 2 deputies. Warren answered the door calmly, as if he'd been expecting them. He offered no resistance, asked only to lock up the house properly before leaving. As deputies searched the property for evidence, Holloway watched Warren's face, looking for guilt, fear, or relief. He saw only exhaustion, the expression of someone whose long burden was finally ending. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A librarian in Lexington reading newspaper accounts of the Fletcher case contacted Sheriff Holloway with information about records she'd discovered while organizing old city directories. The name Helen Marsh appeared nowhere in Lexington's official documentation from 1902. But another name caught her attention: Harold Manning. Harold Manning had been born in Lexington in January 1879, the youngest child of Samuel and Martha Manning. Birth records listed the child as male. Census data from 1880 and 1890 confirmed Harold's existence within the family household. Then after 1900, Harold Manning disappeared completely from all public records. The Manning family home had been sold in 1901, the estate divided after Martha Manning's death. Samuel Manning, listed as deceased in 1897, left no will. The property sale documents showed signatures from 3 adult children: Robert Manning, Catherine Manning Howell, and Harold S. Manning. That final signature, preserved in county archives, showed the same angular, distinctive handwriting that would later appear on Helen Fletcher's documents. A trunk discovered in a Lexington estate sale in 1936 contained letters that shed light on Harold Manning's story. The letters between Harold and someone identified only as J spanned 1898 through 1900. The letters revealed a young person in deep crisis, struggling with an identity that 19th century society had no framework to understand or accept. "I cannot continue this pretense." One letter from March 1900 read, "Every day I wear clothes that feel like a costume, answer to a name that isn't mine, fulfill expectations that crush my spirit. Mother's death has freed me from one obligation, but Robert expects me to take over father's business concerns. He speaks of finding me a suitable wife. The irony would be amusing if it weren't suffocating." Later letters detailed increasing desperation. Harold described feeling trapped between impossibility and unbearable continuation of falsehood. The correspondent J appeared to offer sympathy, but no practical solutions. Harold's final letter, dated August 1900, suggested a drastic plan: "I have saved enough for travel. There are cities where anonymity is possible, where one can construct a new existence. If I cannot live as I truly am, perhaps I can at least escape what I am not." Harold Manning's siblings apparently believed their youngest brother had moved west, a common enough explanation in an era of frontier opportunity. No missing person report was ever filed. The family simply accepted Harold's departure and went on with their lives. The connection between Harold Manning and Helen Marsh remained circumstantial but compelling. The handwriting matched, the timeline aligned perfectly. The physical description from Harold's older sister, preserved in a brief diary entry, fit what neighbors remembered of Helen Fletcher: tall, angular features, large hands, a preference for loose, fitting clothing even in youth. Most significantly, Harold Manning had inherited a small piece of land from his mother's estate, property in Bourbon County that he'd never developed or visited. In 1907, that exact parcel was sold by Helen Fletcher. The transaction Sheriff Holloway had already documented in his investigation of the Fletcher finances. Harold Manning had become Helen Marsh, who had become Helen Fletcher. 3 identities marking one person's journey towards something approaching authenticity, or at least escape from an identity that had become unbearable. The quiet life in rural Harlan County, married to a man who asked no questions and demanded no conventional intimacy, had apparently offered Harold the closest thing to freedom that 1900 Kentucky could provide. But freedom built on deception proved fragile. The letters in that trunk ended in 1900, leaving 18 years of Harold's life as Helen undocumented. Whatever experiences shaped those years, whatever private understandings or arrangements sustained the Fletcher marriage, they remained locked in silence. Only the violent end had forced any of it into public record, and even then, the full truth stayed hidden behind carefully worded official documents that protected reputations more than they revealed reality. Warren Fletcher's past proved equally hidden by deliberate silence and convenient distance. Military records from the Spanish-American War showed his brief service in 1898, a deployment that lasted only 7 months before his discharge. The paperwork listed the reason in careful official language: failure to adapt to military discipline and standards of conduct. A retired Army clerk interviewed in 1931 explained what such phrasing typically meant. They used those words when they couldn't or wouldn't specify the actual offense. Sometimes it meant cowardice, sometimes theft, sometimes behavior they considered morally unacceptable. The vagueness was intentional, protecting the Army's reputation while removing problematic soldiers. Warren had returned to Harlan County briefly after his discharge, but left again within months. Census records from 1900 placed him in Prestonsburg, a town 60 miles northeast, working as a laborer in a lumber mill. Former residents interviewed decades later remembered a Warren Fletcher from that period, though their memories were hazy and sometimes contradictory. One account stood out for its detail. A woman named Agnes Roth, speaking to a researcher in 1942, recalled Warren from a youth in Prestonsburg. There was talk about him, she said carefully. Nothing proven, you understand, but whispers. He kept company with another man from the mill, closer company than folks thought proper. When the mill foreman confronted them about it, both men left town within a week. This was 1901, I believe, maybe early 1902. The other man's identity remained unknown, but Warren's departure from Prestonsburg happened almost exactly when he reappeared in Harlan County and his later marriage to Helen Marsh. The timing suggested flight rather than return, a man seeking refuge in familiar territory while building a new public identity. Warren's parents had died without meeting Helen, sparing him explanations about his sudden marriage to a woman no one in the family had known existed. His only living relative, a cousin in Virginia, later told investigators that Warren had written once after the wedding a brief letter stating he'd married and settled on the family farm. The cousin never visited, and Warren never wrote again. The marriage itself began to look less like romance and more like mutual protection. Two people each carrying secrets that could destroy them in early 20th century rural America, finding in each other a solution to otherwise impossible situations. Warren needed the appearance of conventional married life. Helen needed a place to exist without constant scrutiny or questions about her past. Their financial arrangement suggested careful negotiation rather than traditional marriage. Helen maintained separate accounts, unusual for the period when married women's property typically fell under husband's control. The couple made no joint social appearances beyond the absolute minimum required by community expectations. They produced no children, which raised occasional guessing, but nothing more intrusive than mild gossip. For 18 years, the arrangement worked. Whatever private understanding existed between Warren and Helen, it proved strong enough to withstand isolation, financial stress, and the constant low-level anxiety of maintaining a public facade that went against private reality. But something had changed by 1920. The financial pressures were real enough, documented in bank records and foreclosure notices. Yet money problems alone didn't typically end in violence, especially in a relationship that had survived nearly 2 decades. Something else had introduced instability into the careful balance Warren and Helen had maintained. Letters discovered in the Fletcher farmhouse during the sheriff's evidence collection hinted at that destabilizing factor. Most were ordinary correspondence with merchants and county officials, but 3 letters, hidden in a strongbox beneath the bedroom floorboards, were different. They were addressed to Helen in care of the Evarts post office, dated between January and March 1920. The return address listed only MJ County Courthouse, Harlan County. The letters themselves were missing, apparently destroyed. But their existence suggested Helen had developed connections beyond the isolated farm, communications Warren either didn't know about or couldn't control. In a marriage built on mutual hiding and isolation, any outside relationship represented a potential threat to everything both had constructed. Someone knowing Helen's secret could destroy them both or offer Helen an escape that would leave Warren exposed and vulnerable. The question wasn't whether Warren had motive to kill Helen. The question was, what specifically had triggered violence after 18 years of apparent stability? The winter of 1919 brought unusual hardship to Harlan County. Heavy snows isolated farms for weeks at a time, and an influenza outbreak strained the county's limited medical resources. The Fletcher farm, already under financial pressure, faced additional challenges as frozen ground prevented essential repairs and livestock required expensive extra feed. It was during this period that external pressures came together on the fragile stability Warren and Helen had maintained. The foreclosure notice arrived in January, giving them until spring to settle their debts or lose everything. Prohibition enforcement intensified as federal agents swept through Kentucky's rural counties, searching properties and questioning residents about illegal stills. The new circuit judge appointed in December 1919 brought aggressive reform policies that included reviewing old land transactions and tax records for irregularities. Most significantly, a young attorney named Martin Jessup had taken the position of county prosecutor in November 1919. Ambitious and thorough, Jessup made it his practice to personally review property foreclosures, ensuring legal procedures were followed correctly. This meant he would inevitably visit the Fletcher farm to document the land's condition and verify ownership claims. A traveling salesman named Paul Hendricks provided crucial testimony about the weeks before Helen's death. Hendricks sold farm equipment and made regular circuits through rural Kentucky. In late March 1920, he'd stopped at the Fletcher farm, hoping to interest Warren in a new plow design. "I heard them before I reached the house," Hendricks told investigators. Voices raised in argument, which was unusual because the place was typically quiet as a tomb. "I couldn't make out specific words, but the tone was clear." One voice, which I assumed was Warren's, kept repeating something forcefully. The other voice, higher-pitched but still masculine-sounding, was pleading. That struck me as odd at the time, though I didn't understand why until later. Hendricks had knocked on the door. The arguing stopped immediately. Warren appeared after a long delay, his face flushed, refusing to discuss equipment purchases and asking Hendricks to leave. Through the window, Hendricks glimpsed Helen in the kitchen, her back turned, shoulders rigid. Warren seemed frightened, Hendricks recalled, not angry like you'd expect after an argument, actually frightened, like a man watching his whole world about to collapse. Other witnesses reported similar observations from that final month. The postmaster remembered Warren collecting mail with unusual frequency, always asking specifically if anything had arrived for Helen. A merchant in Evarts recalled Warren purchasing a train ticket to Lexington in early April. Unusual because Warren rarely traveled and never mentioned taking Helen anywhere. Most tellingly, the county clerk's assistant mentioned seeing Helen in town alone in mid-March. This was extraordinary because Helen never came to town unaccompanied. She'd entered the courthouse, stayed approximately 30 minutes, and left without speaking to anyone. The assistant couldn't say which office Helen had visited, but the courthouse housed only 3 departments: the clerk's records office, the tax assessor, and the prosecutor's office. The pieces suggested Helen was planning to leave. The missing money from her accounts, withdrawn gradually over months. The visit to the courthouse, possibly to obtain necessary documents. The arguments Hendricks overheard, likely about Helen's intentions to leave. Warren's fear, justified if Helen's departure would expose their arrangement and destroy what little remained of his reputation and property. Physical evidence from the Fletcher home supported this theory. Deputies found a carpet bag packed with clothing in the bedroom, hidden beneath the bed. The garments were practical traveling clothes, sturdy and plain. Tucked into an interior pocket was a slip of paper with an address in Louisville and a date April 20, 1920. That was the same date the county representative was scheduled to assess the Fletcher property for foreclosure. Helen had apparently planned to leave on the exact day Warren's financial crisis would reach its conclusion. Whether this timing was coincidental or deliberately chosen remained unclear, but the implication was devastating. Helen intended to abandon Warren at his moment of greatest vulnerability, when he most needed the appearance of stable married life to negotiate with creditors or seek assistance. Warren's desperation must have been absolute. 18 years of careful construction collapsing simultaneously on multiple fronts, with the one person who shared his secret preparing to walk away. The question was no longer whether Warren had motive to kill Helen, but whether he'd seen any alternative to violence. The morning of April 14, 1920 began with rain, not the violent storms common to Kentucky spring, but steady, cold rain that turned the farm's dirt yard to mud and made the house feel even more isolated than usual. Warren later claimed he'd been working in the barn since dawn, though investigators found this timeline unlikely given the weather and lack of urgent tasks requiring attention in such conditions. Physical evidence reconstructed a confrontation that began in the bedroom and moved to the kitchen. Furniture showed signs of disturbance, items knocked from surfaces. The packed carpet bag had been pulled from its hiding place, its contents scattered. Whatever triggered the violence, it involved that planned departure and the secrets it threatened to expose. Dr. Brennan's medical examination revealed defensive wounds on Helen's forearms, indicating she'd tried to protect herself. The fatal injury came from a single blow to the back of the skull, consistent with falling backward and striking the kitchen table's corner. Whether Warren struck her deliberately or she fell during a struggle remained unclear, though the violence was undeniable. What happened after the death proved equally significant. Warren didn't call for help immediately. Instead, he spent hours staging the scene, transforming a violent death into something he could present as tragic accident. He cleaned Helen's face, combed her hair, changed her clothing from the traveling outfit she'd been wearing into a familiar house dress. He arranged her body with obvious care, positioning her hands in a gesture of peace she certainly hadn't felt in her final moments. Most disturbingly, Warren had attempted to destroy evidence of Helen's planned escape. He burned papers in the kitchen stove, though he'd been careless enough to leave fragments readable. Investigators recovered portions of what appeared to be a letter, written in Helen's distinctive handwriting, addressed to someone whose name had been burned away. The surviving phrases were partial but suggestive. Finally found courage to wonder if you cannot accept and have lived falsely too long already. The letter suggested Helen had intended to reveal her secret to someone, possibly someone she believed might accept or even return deeper feelings. This added another layer to Warren's motive. He wasn't just preventing Helen from leaving. He was preventing her from sharing their secret with someone unknown. Someone who might expose everything Warren had spent 18 years protecting. Warren's actions after calling for help indicated a man attempting to maintain control even as his world collapsed. He'd met Sheriff Holloway and Dr. Brennan outside the house, physically blocking the doorway initially, explaining that his wife had fallen, that he'd discovered her already deceased. His story emphasized Helen's chronic health problems, her frequent dizzy spells, her general frailty. But once Brennan completed his examination and shared the findings privately with Holloway, Warren's facade crumbled rapidly. When confronted about the inconsistencies in his timeline, about the cleaned scene, about the destroyed papers, Warren had simply stopped talking. He didn't deny. He didn't explain. He retreated into silence that mirrored Helen's 18 years of voicelessness. The arrest came 4 days later after investigators discovered the packed bag and the fragments of Helen's letter. Warren accepted the handcuffs without resistance, his expression suggesting something close to relief. Sheriff Holloway later wrote that Warren seemed less like a man being arrested and more like someone finally permitted to stop performing. In his cell, Warren made one request. He asked for writing materials, stating he wanted to provide a full confession. Holloway supplied paper and pen, expecting a straightforward admission of the events on April 14th. What he received instead was a document that transformed the entire investigation and revealed that the tragedy extended far beyond a marriage maintained through deception and ending in violence. Warren's confession began with 3 words that seemed simple, but carried devastating implications. Helen wasn't leaving alone. The statement suggested complexities investigators hadn't considered, connections they'd missed, and a third person whose role in the Fletcher tragedy had remained entirely hidden until Warren decided the truth, however damaging, had to be told. The confession would reveal that person's identity, and the revelation would shatter what remained of the community's understanding of everything that had happened. Warren Fletcher's confession filled 11 pages of careful handwriting. Sheriff Holloway read it twice before understanding the full implications, and when he did, he immediately called for Prosecutor Martin Jessup. What happened next would become one of the most bizarre twists in Kentucky legal history. The confession explained that Helen had indeed been planning to leave, but not alone and not simply to escape. She'd fallen in love. The object of her affection was someone she believed understood her, someone whose kindness during brief encounters she'd interpreted as romantic interest. That someone was Martin Jessup. According to Warren's account, Helen had first encountered Jessup in February 1920, when the prosecutor visited the Fletcher farm on routine business regarding their foreclosure. Jessup had been professional and courteous, treating Helen with the same respect he'd show any property owner, asking her opinion on land boundaries and structural conditions. For Helen, starved for recognition and dignity after 18 years of hiding, this basic courtesy felt like something profound. Helen began finding excuses to go to town, always timing her visits to match with Jessup's courthouse hours. She'd linger in the building, hoping to encounter him. When she did, Jessup would nod politely, perhaps exchange a brief greeting. To him, these were forgettable moments of professional courtesy. To Helen, they were evidence of a connection she desperately wanted to exist. The letter fragments investigators had recovered weren't farewell notes to Warren. They were drafts of a confession Helen intended to give Jessup, revealing her true identity and expressing her feelings. She'd convinced herself that Jessup's kindness meant he would understand, perhaps even return her feelings. She planned to tell him everything on April 20th, the same day as the foreclosure assessment, believing they could leave together and start fresh somewhere else. Warren had discovered these letters 3 weeks before Helen's death. He'd confronted her, trying to explain that Jessup didn't share her feelings, that she was mistaking professional courtesy for romantic interest. Helen refused to believe him. The arguments Paul Hendricks overheard were Warren trying desperately to prevent Helen from exposing herself to devastating rejection and potentially ruining Jessup's career in the process. On April 14th, Warren found Helen preparing a final version of the letter. She planned to deliver it that very day, unable to wait until the 20th. Warren tried to take the letter, to stop her from making what he saw as a catastrophic mistake. The struggle got worse. Helen fell. Warren claimed it was accidental, that he'd only meant to restrain her, not harm her. But the confession contained something else, something Warren had added almost as an afterthought. Helen died believing Jessup cared for her. I destroyed that letter to protect everyone. But Jessup should know he was the reason, even if he never meant to be. His visits to our property, his basic human decency, gave Helen hope when none existed. Sometimes kindness can be cruel when it's misunderstood. When Sheriff Holloway presented this confession to Prosecutor Martin Jessup, the young attorney went pale. He remembered the Fletcher case, remembered his brief visits to the farm, but claimed he'd been completely unaware of Helen's feelings. He'd treated her exactly as he'd treat anyone else involved in a legal matter. The ethical implications were immediate and devastating. Jessup had been preparing to prosecute Warren Fletcher for murder, but now found himself accidentally central to the case. He'd become the trigger for the tragedy without ever knowing it, without ever doing anything wrong beyond being professionally courteous to someone desperately lonely and misinterpreting normal human kindness. Jessup removed himself from the case on May 2, 1920, citing conflict of interest. His brief statement to the court mentioned personal involvement in circumstances surrounding the deceased's state of mind, but provided no details. The community guessed wildly, but the full truth remained sealed in court records. A special prosecutor from Frankfurt took over the case. Warren Fletcher ultimately pleaded guilty to manslaughter, claiming reduced mental capacity during the confrontation. He received 15 years, A relatively light sentence that suggested the judge found the circumstances complicated enough to warrant mercy. The darkest truth of all emerged only in the final paragraph of Warren's confession, something that made the entire tragedy even more heartbreaking. Martin Jessup had never returned Helen's feelings for the simplest of reasons. He'd never known Helen had feelings to return. Helen had died pursuing a love that existed only in her imagination, killed by someone trying to prevent her from discovering that painful truth. Jessup's professional kindness, his basic human decency in treating Helen with respect, had been misinterpreted into something it never was. And in the end, 3 lives were destroyed. Helen, who'd finally found courage to reveal herself to someone she believed would understand. Warren, who'd killed trying to prevent what he saw as inevitable devastation. And Martin Jessup, who would spend the rest of his life knowing that his ordinary kindness had accidentally set a tragedy in motion, even though he'd done nothing wrong. Sometimes the cruelest thing about secrets is not their revelation, but the desperate, doomed attempts to protect them. If this story unsettled you, if it made you think about the hidden lives people lead and the tragic misunderstandings that can destroy them, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel because we're committed to telling the stories history tried to bury, the cases that reveal uncomfortable truths about how society treated those who didn't fit its narrow definitions. These aren't just historical curiosities. They're reminders of real people who suffered in silence, and we owe them the dignity of remembering their stories, no matter how